Good morning. This is Dr. B. Welcome back. We're going to be spending the next few weeks with remote instruction. This is new to me. I imagine it might be new to you. We'll get through it. I'm going to be as supportive as I can be. So please be supportive of me. I'll do everything that I can to help all of you get through this as best as possible. So, with that assurance, let's start chapter 7. It's going to start 2 chapters of material on metabolism. This particular chapter is going to be the oxidation, if you will, of chemical macromolecules into waste materials like CO2, carbon dioxide, and water, with the production of energy sources such as heat and ATP, the body's energy currency. So, let's delve in here to these 2 processes that we're going to refer to in this unit called metabolism. Our 2 metabolic processes that we're going to discuss are aerobic respiration or cellular respiration in this chapter, and then in chapter 8, photosynthesis. If you look at the figure, you should see the linkage between these 2 metabolic processes. You see that photosynthesis uses sunlight and produces carbohydrates such as glucose. Photosynthesis also releases oxygen. Those 2 molecules tend to be the reactants in respiration. Respiration tends to oxidize molecules such as sugars, and the products of this oxidation are carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide and water tend to be the reactants in photosynthesis. So photosynthesis reduces carbon dioxide to form glucose, and respiration oxidizes it or breaks it down to release carbon dioxide back again. So thus you have 2 very important metabolic processes that basically support the majority of all life here on Earth. Think of the process of respiration that's very important inside the human body. So you have the inhalation cycle that takes in oxygen from the air around us, takes it to the lungs, it diffuses into the bloodstream, travels about in arteries to various places in the body that need oxygen to carry out the oxidation of glucose. The oxidation of glucose, or cellular respiration, results in the release of CO2. It diffuses into veins. Those veins carry that CO2 back to the lungs, where we release it in the exhalation cycle. So breathing is a very important process in the human body to take in oxygen and release CO2, as those 2 molecules cycle throughout the body and are, number 1, used in respiration, that's oxygen, or released in respiration, that's CO2. So within the human body, oxygen and CO2 continually cycle as they're used in respiration. ATP tends to be the energy currency that is produced in both photosynthesis and respiration. It tends to be the universal currency for cellular activity. So it's an energy storage molecule. It is a nucleotide. It's an organic carbon-based molecule with 3 different subunits. First is a nitrogen-containing base that's called adenine. Second is a carbohydrate, a sugar that's called ribose. And third is phosphate groups, of which there are 3. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, a nucleotide, a type of macromolecule that you find within the nucleic acids as their subunits. A nucleic acid would be something like DNA or RNA. ATP is a nucleotide that carries out cellular activities such as the movement of ions in the body, in or out of a cell, the movement of muscle, if you will. Any cellular activity that requires energy, that energy for that activity is supplied by ATP. It is primarily supplied by the breaking of the third phosphate group, which would be the third one on the left. It would be called the gamma phosphate group, as you might see in your textbook. It is considered a paradox that ATP is not stored in living organisms, but if it were stored, it would make the weight of an organism extremely large. It would add a tremendous amount of weight. We, as humans, we might be 500 to 1,000 pounds. If we stored enough ATP to supply us with a day or two of energy. So, when our body needs ATP, we break down or we oxidize carbohydrates, we oxidize lipids, or even proteins. So, when our body needs energy, we break down macromolecules and release ATP from their chemical bonds. When ATP is produced, we refer to that as phosphorylation. When ATP is releasing energy to do cellular activities, we refer to that as dephosphorylation. And that is shown in letter B in the figure, the hydrolysis, if you will, the use of water to split off a phosphate group from ATP to form ADP and release energy. So please keep in mind, ATP is one of the most important molecules for carrying out work at the cellular level. So how do cells make ATP? In this chapter, number 7, we're going to talk about aerobic respiration and then anaerobic pathways, glycolysis and fermentation. They both produce ATP. Aerobic respiration uses oxygen to produce most of its ATP. Glycolysis and fermentation occur in the absence of oxygen and produce a very small amount of ATP. When we move to chapter 8, we will talk of cyclic photophosphorylation that produces a small amount of ATP, again, in the absence of oxygen in anaerobic condition. And then we will talk about oxygenic photosynthesis that produces a fairly large supply of ATP in the presence of oxygen. So again, how do cells make ATP? By both respiration and photosynthesis in an aerobic environment, and then ATP can also be produced in small quantity in an anaerobic environment that lacks oxygen. When we talk of the production of ATP, we have to mention the organelle called the mitochondrion. It is a double-membraned organelle. It's found in eukaryotic cells. It has several distinct compartments. If we go from out to in, the first compartment we would encounter would be the outer membrane. It is considered to be a membrane from the host cell that consumed a bacterium. When we meet compartment 3, the inner membrane, that is considered to be the membrane of the bacterium or the prokaryote. You should notice that the inner membrane is very folded or undulating, and those folds are called cristae. Inside the inner membrane is cytoplasm, and we refer to that cytoplasm as the matrix of the mitochondrion. So you have on the right an electron electron micrograph from an electron microscope, and then you have a drawing. So you can see the two ways of representing a mitochondrion and its structure. All of the little black dots that you see around the mitochondrion are ribosomes. The evolution of the mitochondrion is considered to be from a cell-eating event, and that cell-eating event is called endosymbiosis. Endosymbiosis is a theory that an aerobic bacterium was consumed or engulfed by a host cell. This host cell did not digest the prokaryote, but instead maintained it within a membrane, the outer membrane of the mitochondrion, and this structure became a functioning organelle within the host cell. Mitochondria contain their own DNA, their own ribosomes. They can produce their own proteins. A mitochondrion can divide by a process called fission that's very similar to bacteria. So mitochondria are essentially considered to be prokaryotes, or bacteria that live inside of eukaryotes and produce a large quantity of ATP for their host cells. So that really leads us to the function of the mitochondrion, and the last slide in this part 1 of 3, that mitochondria are the cellular power plants for eukaryotic cells. The majority, 90% or so, of the cell's ATP is produced by a mitochondrion. You see two mitochondria in the photograph from a transmission electron microscope. That's from liver tissue. When we talk about aerobic or cellular respiration in the next video, we will talk about the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, or phosphorylation, that generate the majority of ATP that's produced as organic molecules like sugars and lipids are oxidized by respiration. When I say oxidized, I mean that oxygen is used and that organic molecules like sugars are broken down into their simple components like carbon dioxide. So the process of respiration, aerobic respiration, does use oxygen, and oxygen is used within the mitochondrion to generate the ATP that you see on the slide. The metabolic activity of the cell kind of correlates to the number of mitochondria that cell will contain. So metabolically active cells like liver cells, nerve cells, brain cells typically contain a large number of mitochondria. Skin cells tend to contain very few. Most plant cells only contain 1 or 2 mitochondria because plants are not as metabolically active as the human, as an example. So we have covered now kind of an introduction to what is aerobic respiration, what is ATP, what processes produce ATP, and what structure or organelle inside of the eukaryote produces this ATP, the mitochondrion. So we're going to head to video number 2 and now talk about the 3 steps in aerobic respiration. Thank you, and God bless.